Hey, I'm Hunter from SkillThrive, and in this video, I'm going to show you how to create these adjustable split panels in React.js. Now, we're going to be using a library called React Split, which is wrapper components for Split.js. So if you're using another library or another JavaScript or just JavaScript, plain JavaScript, you can use this in order to achieve the same thing. But because there are those wrapper React components, it's just a lot easier to work with this library using that split component. Now, the first example here is kind of like this Codepen clone. You can see that we have a top and bottom split into half, which is adjustable. We also have this top panel, which is adjustable as well. Now, by default, if we refresh this, you'll see that all of these are the equal size. So if you don't pass any extra props or tell Split.js how to set these by default, it's just going to look at the available space and then divide those into equal spaces. Now, the next example is going to show you how you can pass in certain props to set initial width, and just show you how you can customize this a little bit if you decided to do that for your project. Now, the next example is going to show you how you can use React State in order to handle collapsing these menus really quickly. So if we didn't have these, we would have to have the user come over and drag this if they wanted to minimize it. By adding this button, they can just go ahead, click here, and minimize those windows as they like. And the next thing I want to talk about is just the GitHub branch that I'm using, which is called start here. It just has some starter code to save us some time from having to set this up initially. All it is a nav bar, which is coming from Tailwind UI. I have the pages set up in Next.js, and I also have obviously Tailwind installed because I'm using the Tail UI component library. So now that that's set up, let's go into our code. And the first thing we want to do is let's go ahead and create a new tab here in our terminal, and let's go ahead and install that React Split. So npm install React Split. Once that's done, I can go ahead and close this tab. Then what I'm going to do is I need to create a new folder here called editor. Let's make sure we export everything from this folder so we can get it from this one component file. Go ahead and close this. Inside this editor, we're going to create our first component called editor1.js, and as well, we're going to create an index which exports all the components from this folder. So the first one's going to be export everything from editor1. And now we can go ahead and write our first editor. So the first thing we want to do is just import that split component from React Split. Then we can go ahead and create our component. So export const editor1. And the way this works is that you first you use the split component, then it decides how many panels to create based off of the direct children of the split component. So let's go ahead now and go ahead and use the split. Create two divs. And let's actually, just so we can see these divs, we'll go ahead and give these some different background colors. So because I'm using Tailwind, I can just pass in a utility class like background color, or excuse me, background gray 400. And then the next one I can set to something like background gray 500. So if we save that, we need to, before we can see this, go into our index page, import this from our components folder, and then in between this layout component, I'm just going to go ahead and put editor1, and then let's go into our project and then see if we see anything. So if we refresh this, we don't see anything, and that's because we haven't told this split component how much space it should take up. So in order to do that, remember that this is for the top and bottom, and we only want it to take up the remaining space. So what we can do is we can use a calc function to say, set it to the height of the screen minus the height of the nav bar. So in order to do that, we come back into our editor1. Let's pass in some inline styles here. So style, we want to set it to height, and we just write our calc function right here. So it's going to be calc 100 view height minus 4 rem. Now by default, this split component is going to split the components up like this one on the top. It's going to split them horizontal. Now we don't want that. We want to set it to vertical. So we have to pass in an extra prop here called direction, setting that to vertical. So if we save that and come back and refresh it, you can see now that we're starting to get this starting to look right. But you can see that if we hover over this, we're not getting any indication that this is draggable, although it is draggable if we actually click it. We're not actually seeing any of these styles like we do on this little gutter here. So what we need to do is we need to paste in some styles here in order to get that achieved. And this is just coming right from the Split.js library here. It just shows you some of the values that you can pass in. So what I'm going to do is just go ahead and go into the example that I already have completed here. I'm going to pass or copy these Split.js styles, come back, and then just come into our styles file. And below where we imported Tailwind, I'm just going to paste those, come back into the browser here. And now you can see that this is styled appropriately. And when we hover over it, you see the icon, which signals to the user that this is a area that we can change. So once we have that, let's go ahead now and move on to making those 3 splits on the top panel. So let's go ahead and close out this CSS. And here, this next child is going to be another split component. So we'll say split. Now this one is going to be horizontal, so we don't have to pass in that direction prop, but we do want to pass in a flex class name, which is going to add a display flex to this split, which is just again, a Tailwind utility class. Now this one, we need 3 divs. So the way we can write this really quickly is just say background gray. These are all going to be a 300 and then multiplied by 3. And then that is going to give us exactly what we're looking for here. And I'm actually going to change this one to 400 and then save it. So now if we go and we need to refresh this, you can see now that we have those equal 3 sections, which we can now set to various sizes as we wish. And just to make this really clear, you can even come in here, and if you wanted to change this to 5, 6, and different colors here, just to make sure and show that these sections are actually getting smaller and bigger, you can do that as well. All right, so now that we have that, let's go ahead and move on to our second example, which is editor 2. Now I'm just going to copy editor 1 code, create a new file, paste this in, make sure we rename it, and we also need to make sure that we export it from this file as well. All right, so now that we have editor 2, what we can do is just go ahead and show you how you can pass in some props into the split component in order to get some different default settings. So the first thing we want to do is we want to set the sizes of the 2 top and bottom panels. So what we can do is pass in a sizes component, which could just take in a single value if you wanted them to be the same, but because there's 2, we're going to pass in an array with 2 values. The first one is going to be 30, and the next one is going to be 70. Now, this is a representation of a percentage, so because we want this to fill the entire space, we want to make sure that these 2 numbers add up to 100. So if we save that and go back into our project, actually we need to make sure we have this editor 2 on our example 2. So let's go ahead and make sure we import that. Now if we go to example 2, you'll see that the top and bottom now are different sizes. So again, let's do some more customizations here. And the next thing we want to do is let's change this size as well. So we can say sizes again, which is going to be a value of an array. We say 20, 35, and 45. So if we come back and refresh this, you'll see that these are now those sizes. And we could also change the min width. So right now, these all come down to the same size, which I think is 100 pixels. So in order to change that, we can pass in another prop here called min size. And this works very similar to sizes. So we could just pass in one value if we wanted all of them to have the same minimum size. But because we want all of them to be different, we're going to pass in an array with 3 separate values. So So the first one's going to have a minimum size of 10. The next one is going to be 40, and the next one is going to be 90. So if we save that, we're going to come in and refresh this. And now the first one should be able to go all the way down to 10 pixels. So if you look at this, I misspelled that, so it'd be min size. Now let's refresh it again. So this one should go all the way down to 10 pixels. This one should go all the way down to 40, and then this one, if we go the other way, should go to 90. All right, so that just gives you an idea of some of the props that you can pass in order to customize this for your project. And now let's go ahead and move on to the last example, which is going to be that button that closes the panel automatically. So let's go ahead and just copy this editor 2, create a new component called editor 3. While we're at it, go ahead and just paste it here, renaming it, saving it, and then making sure we export it from this file. And while we're at it, let's go ahead and come into example 3 and import that editor 3. And then put it here in between the layout components. So editor 3, like I already mentioned, is going to be using React state in order to track which index or which panel needs to be collapsed. So what we can do is go ahead and import useState from React. So say import useState from React, and go ahead and save that, and go ahead and create a new state called collapsed index, and then set collapsed index will be the function we use in order to change that. And by default, we will set this to a value of null because we don't want any of them to be collapsed initially. Now I'm getting this this idea again from the docs. So if we go back into the docs, we actually need to go into the React portion here. If you scroll down to the bottom, you'll see that these are all the props that you can set. And then there's also this section called migrating from Split.js, which talks about down here that the collapse index, which before, if you're just using the API, is just a function, but now it becomes a prop, which is the value of the index that you want to be collapsed. And now what we need to do is we need to pass that prop into this top panel here. So we'll say collapsed equals the collapsed index. So again, by default, it's null, so nothing's going to be collapsed. And now we want to go ahead and we want to create these the button as well as the sections for all of these. So now let's go ahead and I want to create a wrapper component down here called options, which is just going to be some shared styles. The only prop this is going to have is children because we're going to wrap the button in this. And we're just going to have some styles here. So just to save some time, I'm just going to copy these and then talk really quickly about the utility style. So this sets the background to gray, 300. It sets it to relative, so the button knows what to be relative to. Then overflow is hidden because once we go on smaller screens, we don't want the buttons to be over certain panels. So just to make sure that they're hidden, we set this to absolute because we're going to put the button here. We set it top left and the top and left to 2. And then we also have this flex column in case we wanted to add more buttons, and then it'll space it out by, I think 2 is for rim in Tailwind UI, but regardless, you'll see here that this is just going to give it a little container for it to float onto the top left. All right, so now that we have that, what we can do is we can go ahead and just pass in that component here. And we're going to pass this in 3 times. So if we save this and go back into example 3, you'll see that we still have these values. So I'm actually going to get rid of these because I want the default behavior. Refresh it. Okay, so you can see everything looks as expected. These options are just essentially just other divs. And now we need to go ahead and create the collapse button. So let's go into our components and create a new folder called button. And I'm going to create a button or a new component called collapse. Whoops. Then we create a new index. Keep messing this up. Making sure that we export this button. Go ahead and close this out. And this is going to be a really simple button. And we're going to be first importing an icon from a library called React Icons, which I already have installed. And this comes from, again, React Icons. And then a subfolder called by, because this is a group called box icons. Then we can go ahead and create our component. And just to save some time here, I'm going to copy this button, paste it in. And we also need to pass in this onClick prop, which is going to be the function that this button uses. All right, so now that we have that, let's go ahead and back to our editor 3. We need to import this collapse button from the components. So import collapse button from, let's see here, our components library. Then in between each of these options, we want to go ahead and just paste in that collapse button. So let's go ahead and do that here. And remember that we have to pass in an onClick event handler. So onClick. And this is going to take in that function called setCollapseIndex. And remember, because indexes start with 0, we have to say that this is index 0. So now I'm just going to replace these, setting it to the appropriate index value. And if we save it, come back into editor 3, we have to refresh this. So it looks like we might have forgot to export something from this, and that's because this button is not exported from this index file. So we need to make sure we export everything from that folder. Whoops. Now if we go back, refresh this, now you can see the button. And once we click on this, you'll see that this panel minimizes, then this one. And because this one minimizes, this one's going to spread out through the full width. And there you have it. You can see how easy it is to create these adjustable split panels in React using the React Split library. If you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up, consider subscribing, and be sure to check out our other videos as well as our guides and our blog posts on skillthrive.com. Again, I'm Hunter from SkillThrive, and I'll see you in the next one.